Hello and welcome. You're viewing the Citizens Journalist podcast, Mesa County Compass, that brings you the news that you can use from a different point of view. I'm Ruth.
I'm Lisa.
And together we are Mesa County Compass. Our goal is to create an informed, current, active citizenry armed with the facts. We will be covering what's new to you, what it means to you, what you can do about it, and provide you access to the decision makers when we can. Good afternoon. We're here with Mesa County Compass, and today we are interviewing Mr. Hogan Peterson, who is actually the Governmental Affairs Director for the Grand Junction Realtors Association and Homebuilders Association. We'll be discussing the sustainability and adaption plan that is being in the process, actually in the working process. So welcome.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Good. So give us a little bit of background. How did you come into this position, and what do you do?
Absolutely. Well, I'll back up and take it kind of from the top. So in my current role, I represent both the Realtors Association and the Homebuilders Association. I do government affairs, which means that I do policy advocacy work on behalf of our members and on behalf of the values of home ownership and responsible policy throughout the Western Slope and especially Mesa County. Prior to this role, I have a background in various advocacy organizations and political strategy, but I'll take it all the way back to the beginning here and start from a little bit earlier on. I grew up in Rifle here on the Western Slope. I was always interested in public policy and what have you, but attended CMU, studied political science there. Was fortunate, just fresh out of college, I was hired by Senator Cory Gardner's office locally, where I had a number of roles, but in the policy space, we spent a lot of time working and thinking about natural resources. Moved on, I was the Western Slope director for Congresswoman Bobert's office. And then I spent a little over a year as the state director for the Mule Deer Foundation for Colorado, doing big game conservation and habitat advocacy work. So I've been in this role for about a year right now. It's been an interesting ride for sure. But why do organizations like this really need to have a full-time government affairs representative? Ultimately, if you look at how industries are regulated, or maybe how different levels of government have control over what the rules are within their jurisdiction. Housing, real estate, development, and industry are among the most regulated industries that we have.
They are.
We're not as bad as healthcare, so we've got that going for us.
A little bit.
But where it gets really interesting is on housing and development policy. We're one of the few areas that's regulated by every level of government. Most housing policy is set at the local level. So if we're talking about a site in the city of Grand Junction, most of the regs that apply to them are going to be city regs. But we're also subject in that same house to Mesa County regulation in a number of ways. Certainly impacted by the state of Colorado, certainly impacted by the feds. There's almost nothing a government can do that isn't going to have some ramifications for housing in one way or another. And because of that, it's also a very technical industry. It's wonky. It's a very specific skill set, either on the realtor or the developer side, which means that a lot of the time, elected officials, even if maybe they're on our side of a given issue or are sympathetic, I'm giving a lot of people a lot of credit there, but because it's so technical and all enveloping, it's often difficult for those folks to understand maybe the first, second, third order consequences of a given law or policy.
So that's where you step in.
That's exactly right, yeah. So in a nutshell, I describe my job as being something of a translator. Folks on city council, for example, they speak city council language. They're volunteers for the most part. That's not their full-time job. They all come from different professions and have background and experience from all over the place. They speak city council language. And then realtors and home builders, they also speak a very specific language. But they're full-time and they don't necessarily speak lawmaker, policy, or city council language. So a lot of the time, you're just putting things in a way that both parties can understand. So I take the interests, concerns, impacts that people within my membership or within the community have on this set of issues. distill it down into the ultimate important elements in a way where I can have that conversation with policymakers. And then I take proposed legislation, processes, debates. I take that language and go explain it back to my members so that we can organize to advocate for A, B, or C.
So
You are a peacemaker then.
I think there's an environment where you can be a peacemaker, and I always think that problems are probably best solved at the lowest level. I think a lot of stuff in the housing space that's relatively controversial as a policy, a lot of the time is not as radically different between two schools of thought as it looks. A lot of the time we speak a different language and can probably find a path forward. But then there are times where elected officials or a given government has profound philosophical differences between maybe the position that I'm there to advocate. By all means, that's their right. We have different goals, and ultimately they serve the community, and the community can decide if that vision is the one they want to vote for or not. But when that happens, then that becomes a question of organizing formal opposition, debate. Ultimately, within my role, there is an element of election strategy. I would love to see people who understand real estate, who care about housing affordability, who understand how this works together, elected to public office. And that's true all the time, obviously. But within those bounds, those are kind of the pieces we're playing with on the chessboard, so to speak.
So have the realtors and the home builders, have they had a position like this for someone before? Are you new to is this a new position?
It's largely a new position. Yeah, I'm the first full-time staffer here, and we actually also have a consultant presence in this space that makes up a team. Diane Schwenke, who used to run the the Grand Junction Chamber, also represents us in government affairs as a consultant.
Nice.
And lo and behold, I don't know if maybe our leadership wondered at some point, dreaming up this role, is there really a full-time amount of work to do in this space? Yes.
And then some.
Yeah, there certainly is.
Okay, and so I understand that you are on the sustainability and adaption plan. You're part of the group that's making this plan.
Yeah, so I'm on the technical working group.
So what does that mean?
I'll back up. So this plan is going through a public planning process. That means that city council and city staff who are responsible for planning regulations and development have a policy that they want to create or are mandated to create. And oftentimes they'll convene citizen stakeholder groups, who have different specialties and represent different interests within our community to come together and try to provide feedback as they go through the process of creating that draft. I think there's about 15 to 20 of us on this working group. I was appointed to that late last year because of my interest in the housing and advocacy space.
So did you apply for that position? Did you know it was coming up? Or
I did,
how
yeah.
did this happen?
Yeah, I think some city staff asked if I was interested as they're trying to pick some representative cross-sections of voices in this space. Ultimately, the members of this group still had to be confirmed by city council who voted for that.
Okay. One more question on that. I hear it referenced frequently, even in the documents, city staff. Who are the city staff that we are talking about?
That's a good question. City staff is one of two things in this case. There's the full-time staff who work in the planning department, the housing department. Junction is, I think, probably relatively small in that space, but because we have a volunteer city council rather than a strong mayor system, our city council members ultimately have day jobs. They're here as volunteers. They spend a lot of time on city council stuff. They're just not really getting a whole lot of money for it. They don't really have the capacity as individuals to sit down and draft legislation and solicit public feedback and all that. So the planning department is ultimately responsible for all of the different plans that govern our city. That could be zoning regulations, that could be development regulations or road infrastructure. And they too, I think, have more than a full-time job. So that's the primary department at play here. But we also have a sustainability coordinator in this case who's the lead on this project, and it is concerned primarily with sustainability, adaptability, and environmental issues. And I think I've characterized her role right.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's also another party too, right? I think they called them. I think I have it written down. Ruth.
Let me pass that back to you.
Not a problem.
Yeah. It has a name. A Civic Spark Fellow.
Yes, so I've met the individual. They've been pretty involved throughout the process. I believe that's a grant-funded position to help with planning in certain areas, and I can't remember what the funding source is on it, but yeah. And then the second thing that I might be referring to when I say staff, I probably need to get more clear about that. The city often hires consultancies in planning or engineering to help craft these, to help conduct the drafting process. And in this case, there's a consultant that's been involved throughout this process as well.
Mm-hmm. And the budgeting for that comes from where? Why? How was it authorized? And
yeah, so for most of the time, I believe that planning consultants or engineering consultants are part of the standard city budget the council appropriates money for every year. From one plan to another, there may be somewhere where consultants are paid by a grant. I know, for example, we completed the EV readiness plan sometime late last year for our town. And I believe Excel Energy contributed a pretty significant amount of staff resource to help shore up that plan. But it would just depend on the situation.
So it's within their budget that they just vote on their own budget for saying this is a plan and this is what we need to implement it. Do they go through any sort of process for the public to be involved in this sort of spending?
As a line item, I wasn't privy to that conversation.
Okay.
That might have been appropriated well before I was ever involved in this specific plan. We're more concerned with the details of the plan itself.
Okay.
But I will tell you, City Council ultimately has responsibility for every budget line item.
Right.
They do an annual budget every year where most of that stuff is done. Obviously, they have the right to appropriate money for anything at any time, so long as they can pay for it.
Right.
And sometimes when they can't.
Yeah.
If that's something citizens were concerned about, that's all public record information. City Council's a pretty open book. You can go to a meeting and comment on that or raise the concern as a citizen group. But again, it would just depend on the issue.
Okay.
And this has been in the works for how long?
This plan started really late last year formally. That said, the basis for this plan comes from a couple different sources. So numerous elements that this plan would address are mandated by the state legislature, and there have been various laws and mandates passed over the last couple sessions.
Okay, can you be a little specific on that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'll give you a couple examples
Okay.
here. If you want to look, I believe this was last session, our state legislature has passed laws, for example, on actual energy and resource development. So that might be municipalities are required to inventory their greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay.
Or municipalities are required to upzone their building regulations to a certain energy code and a certain standard. So at any given time, if you're going to do a new build, that house is going to be subject to whatever the prevailing energy code at the moment is.
Okay.
The state legislature ultimately dictates that code, and it gets updated periodically.
They set that. Okay.
Yeah, so this plan addresses a couple elements like that. There's a greenhouse gas inventory component to that. It also lets the city set targets in a number of policy areas that the state legislature either has already said municipalities are going to have to do, or that the state legislature is likely to pass future legislation on. So I think the idea here is it's a lot of birds with one stone. There's these issues that are kind of true of any local government in any town. This is a portfolio of policy recommendations that could address any number of items.
Okay. Why don't, and I'm sorry, Ruth, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
Why don't you go through and tell us what this plan, what are the basic components of this plan, and then maybe how it will impact
Absolutely.
the taxpayer, the resident, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So one really key detail of this is that this is what's called a visionary plan. So it lays out general targets or a general philosophy for the next however many years. It would be not unlike One Grand Junction, the city comprehensive plan. It really kind of sets goals, but doesn't itself propose specific regulations.
Okay.
Whereas if you were to look, for example, at our zoning and development code, that lays out actual technical rules and requirements.
Right.
Why that matters, though, is that any actual technical planning document, law that the city is subject to, takes its inspiration or its mandate to do certain things from a higher level visionary plan. So what's in the comprehensive plan, for example, they take those goals and themes, and those drive the basis for what the technical regulations are going to be. This plan is itself going to be that type of document, and it was inspired by that document. So our comprehensive plan identified a number of things this pertains to that the city wanted to do some planning work on in the future. And then this plan will itself inform decisions made about technical plans moving forward. That's why this plan is actually important, though. It would be easy to look at a philosophical document like this and say, well, it doesn't really have any teeth. It's kind of like New Year's resolutions. It's stuff you might want to do. But ultimately, every policy that the city passes for the time that this document actually governs them, until it's altered or replaced or whatever by a future city council, is going to be informed by this document. So they'll take this into consideration in all the decisions they make. That means that if there was something that maybe I didn't like as an advocate for housing, or that any number of other citizens would have concerns about as advocates for any number of other things, the language in this is likely going to influence the decisions that council makes in the future. It's likely going to justify decisions that they make. And if there's something you don't like where you're not aligned with this will make it a lot harder to disagree. And if there's something you do like that's not, the same is true. But flip side of all of that, if there's something that a citizen or group supports as a policy consideration in the future, you can argue the ways that it aligns with this plan or any other visionary plan, and that kind of justifies it or helps make the case that this is what the community came up with.
Okay.
So hope that covers it. I'll get into specifics if you'd like.
Oh, well, I would. Maybe you could go through the key themes for us.
Absolutely, yeah.
And tell us if there's anything that you're concerned with in any of those as far as your role in what you do.
Yeah, so there's 5 primary themes here, and the themes were themselves identified out of a list of possible topics in this policy arena. The technical group, myself and the others, kind of chose to prioritize based on what we thought was important, but they also did community feedback at public events and with short-term working groups from different sectors, consolidated all of that and came up with, hey, these are kind of the 5 that we think are high priorities. So they call those the key themes. Right now, there's really 5 primary ones. They come down to climate resilience, energy stewardship, waste management, water conservation, and built environment.
Okay, and that's very nice. What do they mean?
Yeah, we'll go. They've also divided it based on how people responded to how important they thought those categories were into kind of a higher priority area, aka a lot of people generally are interested in this, medium priority, and lower priority. So we'll start up high, and I can give you a little background on each. Number 1 priority, this is an area I think everybody probably does agree on. We might disagree on what to do about it at some point, but I think there's consensus here, and that's water conservation.
Right.
Little self-explanatory there. I think we have a lot of concerns, as do most Western governments at this point. I'll give you an example, though, that's interesting. The city recently voted to support the purchase of the Shoshone water rights from Xcel Energy to the Colorado River District. That's obviously a really expensive thing for the River District to buy, and they've been getting support from all the downstream or whatever communities. This plan hasn't passed yet, but when the city council decides whether or not to appropriate money on that, conversations like these help them make the case for that decision or against it as it may be.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on the water conservation, though, how much does that impact the individual in what they can use, and how much is government saying, no, you don't have access to water?
Right. That's the lens I try to look at all this through, is the individual homeowner, home purchaser, resident of our community. A lot of the values that we're going to talk about have all sorts of associated rules and regulations, some of which might actually have a real benefit, right? Regardless of who you are. But often there's a cost associated with doing that. If you mandate higher energy efficiency in your buildings, your power bill will probably be lower if you buy that house, and the community might use less power, but the house itself will be a little more expensive, right? So you have to weigh those factors. When it comes to water conservation, the plan primarily addresses municipal water uses. So for the individual resident, at this point, I'm not sure there will be a ton of individual impacts. I think a lot of folks could argue individual benefits in this case, and that it's sustainable and it's adaptable. We'll have water conserved for the future by not being super reckless with it.
And is that a problem right now that people are super reckless with the water?
I don't know if it is. I certainly don't think so at the moment. That said, I mean, if this is a question of how many resources are getting divided between how many people. If our population keeps going up, the amount of water we have doesn't go up with them, so we have to figure out how to split it.
I'm just going to ask something that is totally maybe off base.
Sure.
But this encompasses the city only?
It is, yeah. It's just the city.
At this time?
Mm-hmm.
How long before it spreads?
Well, that would be a great question for the county or whoever. Different governments will have some sort of equivalent of this at one way or another. With the city of Grand Junction and Mesa County, their equivalent planning documents are often at odds with one another, so that could be interesting. Water conservation, I think most Western Slope governments are more or less going to be in agreement on.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Yeah, but again, this doesn't actually propose a specific policy on any of these, but it can identify maybe examples or whatever.
Right.
So if you want to look at this, the city, for example, has been standing up a turf replacement program, a grant program for people who would like to replace their actual yard with a turf one. I don't have anything to say about the pros and cons of that, but it might be something the individual would do to use less water or what have you.
Right.
But no, I don't see this plan justifying some sort of, hey, you're over your daily limit of water, so we're taking your shower head away type of thing.
Okay,
Well,
so go ahead and continue on with your priorities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry.
So the number 2 priority it identifies is renewable energy. Maybe a little less consensus on that one. A lot of the policy recommendations within that particular item are driven by the state legislature. They're stuff that our communities are going to have to do something about one way or another. This is kind of a chance to steer how do you want to implement that. So, for example, they passed the EV readiness plan late last year that, from what I understand, stands up different charging infrastructure or what have you. There's state regulation that passed recently, this would have been last session, mandating that new home construction has EV chargers within it.
Oh, yeah?
This plan doesn't speak to that. That was prior and kind of out of our wheelhouse. But that's a good example of how stuff impacts the individual, right? All things considered, why not have another amenity in your house? I mean, you might well enjoy that. You might make it easier for you to buy that car if you're into that. But if every house has to have that, a pretty good chunk of those people just don't have an electric car. It's not doing them any good.
And can't afford it.
And that's the next thing is an EV charger is an added expense when you build a home. It raises the floor if all homes have to have that or anything else. However cheap a home was allowed to be built before you require something, that floor goes up a little bit.
Right.
So certainly worth noting.
Right. And with the average price of a home here being $400,000, adding a little bit is taking away the amount of people that can afford a home.
Yeah, well, that's a tough one. You know, that's a value proposition every elected official has to weigh. I'm here to advocate for home ownership or access to it. We have a market where it can be very challenging for people to get the money to do that.
We do, indeed.
And I can speak with a little concern about that example because it's not part of this plan.
Right.
I think that if you mandate certain amenities in your community, in your homes, if you can afford a home at that price point, that's probably all good and well. There might be benefits in your neighborhood and in the broader town overall. But someone who can't afford to live in a town in the first place, any benefits aren't really relevant to that person, right? So, we could mandate that every house has a swimming pool.
Right.
And it'd be awesome. I would love to have a house with a swimming pool or live in one where everybody else did too. But you haven't provided swimming pools if you've priced people out of buying those homes.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. But actually, though, Ruth, you made a good point asking, is it just the city? If you look at the actual sources of water use across the Western Slope, the preponderance of that's going to be agricultural, right? It's not subject to this one way or another. That's the canal companies and the like.
I was just wondering how quickly it'll filter out because I've seen it happen already. I've been in this town long enough to watch what happens with the small city, which Grand Junction was, and it's growing, and it's growing, and it's growing. How far it's going to spread,
Sure.
just a curiosity item for me.
No, it's worth
Go
keeping
ahead,
in
yeah.
mind. So yeah, I just thought it was noteworthy there. I think
Oh, absolutely.
probably most people in Grand Junction, myself included, would agree that all things equal, it'll be better if each individual uses water more responsibly rather than less, right? Whether or not that should be mandated is another debate, but we do have a limited water supply. We're strained. By all means, let's do some conservation work there. But if we got a little too overzealous on that and started doing requirements that impose real consequences on citizens, makes things either more expensive or difficult or whatever.
I think of people in the commercial industry. They are dictated as to how they can landscape their property between the street and their business. And up to this point, it has been quite a water hog, quite frankly.
That would make sense.
So now then they're going to have to reverse all of those policies with something like this and start going backwards to make it more efficient.
They could have to reverse it if they wanted to recommend certain things. But actually, I would point you to any number of 2 plans that the city has that cover a certain subject matter. Those contain contradictions all the time. We have a housing needs assessment in Grand Junction, which is another visionary document.
Oh, yeah, I saw that in there.
Yeah, so they came up with that several years ago, recognizing that we're starting to have a real housing affordability problem. And it identifies itself in a number of priorities and areas, many or most of which I think I agree with and a lot of our community would. But oftentimes, if you want to look, for example, at the new road engineering requirements plan the city passed late last year, the housing needs assessment says that all things considered, we need to be incentivizing density in new development, so stuff packed closer together. A lot of arguments in favor of that. If you get our inventory up, that helps prices. Some people might want to live in a denser area. That's all good and well. If you look at the technical engineering design standards document, it proposes wider sidewalks and wider roads and things that ultimately require less density. Well, those are at odds with one another, and they kind of cancel each other out to a point. So if you're looking for all the documents to line up, you'll probably be disappointed.
It's not going to happen. Understood.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, within the technical working group, these first 2 I think are pretty uncontroversial, and even renewable energy, like a lot of this plan, I'll play devil's advocate for it, and for my peers here, really prescribes carrots a lot more than sticks. I haven't necessarily seen any recommendations that are, hey, we're going to ban gas stoves in new construction or anything like that. It's more, hey, we're going to get it on paper that should we decide to pursue a grant program in the future, should we decide to offer developer rebates or whatever, we could incentivize people to choose one over the other. There's some philosophical concerns I think a lot of people would have with that too, but I'll stay away from it for today. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Did you want to talk low priorities or?
I do want to run down at least a couple more here because
please.
I think they're important. And I'm trying to give the devil his due here on a ton of different perspectives represented here, and I want to make a good faith representation of their perspective on this. I'm really, again, looking at all through the nexus of housing affordability, but it's worth considering pros and cons here. Number 3 is waste management. I probably would have ranked this a little higher, maybe right below water conservation. Again, as the population grows, as we have limited landfill space, this is one I think everybody can agree on. Identifies what maybe our goals should be there, identifies more of a need for certain types of things. So it doesn't necessarily say you have to create an electronic waste recycling program, for example, but it says our community needs that or would benefit from that or whatever.
We can tell that when we drive down our streets in April.
No, that's for sure. Yeah. Again, it's something I think the community is probably going to support in that case. And it's a lot of this is stuff that's thinking pretty far ahead, right? If you actually get to a landfill right now, they're not even close to full. They have a ton of capacity, but they're also not making any new land. So at some point, space runs out.
Central, yes.
Yeah. Number 4 is energy efficiency. This one, I think, if you're going to talk about the ways a community uses energy, this is probably a little less controversial than the renewable energy one. Are we using our energy effectively? Are we being wasteful or not? The recommendations I've seen with this one are again, mostly municipal. Government buildings are going to prioritize energy efficient design over other values.
And what's the impact of that for the whole community?
I could see maybe 2 buckets of impact there. On one hand, I'll devil's advocate this. A lot of the city of Grand Junction's fleet vehicles utilize a compressed natural gas that's generated by landfill and sewage. That's probably a net benefit to us. I think they've shown that saves a ton of money compared to if they were buying gas and gets maybe some of that gas out of the system. But if the government wants to mandate that its own buildings be more efficient, in one sense, the taxpayers are going to be paying lower energy bills and all that. But then in the other sense, should those buildings need remodeled, should other buildings be constructed, those buildings might be a little more expensive. It also creates a certain pressure, I think, for private industry to play by those same rules. That's a separate conversation, but again, it's not totally harmless, if that makes sense. But for the most part, I think our community probably can agree that we don't want to be wasteful with energy. We've been through a lot of booms and busts over the years. We kind of know that game.
Well, the booms and busts were not created by...
No, they're not created by usage.
Using
energy.
Energy. So you can say that oil shale was not a cost-effective way of gathering the oil.
Yeah, that's actually a good way to put it.
And so, but to say that energy efficiency is going to change the way that things are...
Right.
How much energy is used or...
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I'd hedge that too in terms of energy usage and energy scarcity. The local government, pro or con, doesn't have a lot of control over federal energy policy, which is what drives the cost of things, what type of gas we use, and all of that. All things equal, provided that it's not punitive or imposing costs on private citizens. If we can find realistic ways to use less energy rather than more where we can, that's probably a benefit
you
to
know
us.
how you could use less energy? Turn off the lights.
You could.
I mean,
you could.
There are things that are already there rather than rebuilding and reconstructing, because many of the things that they propose end up taking more energy in the long run. I know I'm putting you
you're okay
on the spot on that, but for instance, an electric vehicle, we know that we don't produce all of the sources that we need to make the electric vehicle here.
Right.
Most of it's in China. We know that those batteries are hard to get rid of. We know those batteries have to be replaced frequently.
And they're expensive.
And the car itself is expensive. So if you're mandating these charging stations, which also use more energy
on
than
an
gas.
antiquated grid.
Yeah. So it's creating, in order to make what they want, it takes so much more from the taxpayer, who already can't afford what the costs of due to inflation. So it seems to me like some things that we have done in the past and said, be a better steward.
Yeah.
Instead of the government's going to make you a better steward.
That's a key difference here, and that's really how I personally look at a lot of this conversation. Do we want to be good stewards of our environment, of our resources? Well, absolutely they do. I think that's a value that a lot of us hold one way or another.
It is.
If a municipal government gets into the business of mandating more and more things, which this plan really doesn't do yet, but it could be the basis of future requirements or what have you, that becomes a little bit different. But I think when this plan is doing it well, or when an element has it correct, it's, hey, we're going to preemptively identify the infrastructure needs associated with people having the ability to make certain choices one way or another.
So that just actually depends on the people you have in office.
It does, yeah. And this plan is going to be used multiple ways by multiple future city councils.
Exactly.
Yeah, how our current council interprets this might be very different than the next one or the like. I'll get on a soapbox here as an institutionalist and say whatever regulations you make, be careful that the next guy holding your seat it's something you'd be comfortable with them controlling.
Exactly.
So at this point, I haven't necessarily seen anything that could be actively weaponized, but don't count your chickens before they hatch, right?
There you go.
Yeah.
And we appreciate you being involved so you know what's going on and what the impacts are, and being a person that can see this is what the intent is, and like you said, interpreting for us what's going on.
Your ability to look into the future rather astonishes me. I think you are able to do that more than many of our city council members, if you will.
I better refrain from comment there, but thank you.
Yeah.
Well, the next one's one I'll tell you, I bristled a little bit at the terminology here at first. Obviously, I have a lot of things that I'm still not comfortable with in this conversation on this item. But actually, it's something I think if it's done right, we could maybe find some consensus on
The
it.
built environment.
Actually, I'll look at climate adaptation. And you'll note this is the Sustainability and Adaptation Plan. I think a lot of us will hear that terminology and jump straight to, hey, we're going to mandate that you ride a bike everywhere so you don't make greenhouse gas. Or
you have to walk, you have to ride a bike, you have to use your scooter.
Yeah.
Can you see me on a scooter? Now give me.
I'd like to, but no.
He'd pay for it.
No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't.
No, he said he'd pay for it.
Oh,
yeah, of course.
Pay to watch.
Right.
So if you want to look at the climate adaptation question, and again, this is just, hey, looking way down the road, we have a goal of being prepared for any changes that might be coming. I'll actually lump this in with resilience and hazard resilience because I think there's a lot of overlap between the two. And we've seen a lot of trends environmentally, and I'll take my 10-foot pole and use it to not touch the debate over why that's happening and what we should do about it. Our community, like a lot of communities, often sees less water than we used to, or higher temperatures, or more variability, or whatever. All things considered, if we want to build our community in the future, it's best that we be prepared for maybe some of the impacts that certain projections could cause. For example, I'll look at the hazard resilience side of it. What Colorado's definitely seen a lot of across the board is wildfires, recently and compared to what we used to have. This one, actually, I think you can look at even without the whole climate change controversy. In some of my prior roles, especially doing conservation work, a lot of the drivers of our big forest fires in the West come from 100-ish years of bad forest management, where prior generations got this idea that, hey, fire is a bad thing, it's scary, we're going to suppress it. Well, what we did was aggregate 50, 60, 70 years of unburnt fuels. As a result of that, when fire does inevitably happen, we end up having huge fires instead of little ones. Western Colorado is definitely subject to that, and
it is indeed.
In my big game habitat work, a lot of the projects that we would fundraise for and do out on the ground were nothing more than tree thinning. If you were to time machine yourself back to, I don't know, Glade Park, any federal public land around here, that's all the desert pinyon juniper stuff. Right now, we have a very, very thick tree cover of that type for the most part. If you time machine back 100 years, there actually would have been a lot less trees. For a number of reasons, it's not good for the environment that we're in this case. But what we've also seen as our populations and cities have grown is housing and communities expanding into what we call the wildland-urban interface. The buildings are closer to the trees, so when fires happen, houses get burned down too. I think this done well would say we're going to be making some of our planning and policy decisions with an eye to the fact that our fire risk has gone up. That might be, if you want to look around Boulder, I guess this last week, Xcel Energy did our state's first preemptive turn off the electricity so the power lines don't cause a wildfire problem. I think that one's a whole can of worms. I guess people have had a lot of anger about that. But part of that's driven by the fact that there have been a lot of fires around the West caused by power lines lately.
It's kind of a devil's in the detail type thing.
Russ Andrews had a good point for like the beetle kill. He proposed that, he said, if I were elected, this would be the first thing that I'd like to propose. He says, I think it's a win-win that you go in and you get paid for taking out the trees, and you don't get taxed if you're selling a product made for those trees. And he said, but one of the problems is that the Bureau of Land Management makes you take so much out. Instead of saying you can take out 40, you can take out fewer acres and use it and let people do that, instead of saying, no, you have to have this huge tract of land, which makes it very expensive. And so some of that is already the policy is in place that's making it more expensive to solve the problem.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense to me.
And so coming in here and say we need another policy, well, no, let's just take off that other policy that allowed us to take care of the problem.
Let's relook at the policies, exactly. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember, it was one of the presidents, I think, it would either have been a Coolidge or Wilson perhaps, had said, I think it's a lot more important to prevent bad bills than it is to pass good ones. Makes a lot of sense to me.
Does indeed.
But if we want to look at, hey, what might a changing environment, what impacts might that have on someone living in our community 10, 20, 30 years from now? Some of that stuff we can reasonably guess ahead of time and make planning decisions that it'll lessen the impacts there and make it not such a pain in the butt. That's all good. I think the value proposition here to be certain where you want your pendulum to fall. We could do a lot in that space that would be beneficial, and at a certain point it might become not worth it level expensive.
Yeah, you have to watch how far that pendulum swings.
That's right. We could do very little or nothing in that space and maybe even end up regretting that we hadn't done a little bit more. I know where the pendulum falls for me. The plan, in good faith, I think, identifies that there is a range of options here. Really, when future voters and citizens are electing members of city council, that's kind of the time to make the decision on what balance of cost and benefit do I want to elect. This sets the stage for that, if that makes sense. Because to be clear, any of these things, they could be implemented really poorly. That's a lot of the concern I have with the document. It's why I've been involved. You could interpret this in a way that mandates a very, very expensive, environmentally friendly community. Maybe it's a good place to live if you make $800,000 a year, but maybe it's not such a good place if you're making $40,000 a year.
Right, exactly.
Not going to happen.
Yeah. So there's basically always additional benefit that you could buy at the right price, right? I could go buy a Ferrari, but I would have to sleep in it. Not really worth the cost in that case.
Exactly.
So devil's definitely in the details.
Okay, so I'm looking over your shoulder here, and we're on to the lower priorities. Would you kind of briefly give that, and that last one is the one I'm curious about.
Yeah, I'll run down all three for you real quick. Agriculture is 7. That one, at least the way that I saw that question, and I don't know about the rest of my committee, but possible, the actual agriculture that happens in Mesa County, very little of that's in city limits. I think that's why people viewed it as a lower priority. But when we look at other items in here, water conservation or whatever, we still know that agriculture is important in our community. It's a big employer and all that. I would like to see water saved for that, or fire hazards kept down, or whatever.
And we like to eat.
Yeah, most of all, you like to eat.
Yep.
Yeah, but I know that a couple side conversations, smaller elements of this have pertained to food access, grocery store prevalence, the kinds of local food available in our community. This might be interpreted in that space as, hey, we're going to incentivize more farmers markets, or when we're deciding whether or not to approve a permit for a new grocery store, maybe we can say that, yeah, we should approve that, or yeah, we should deny that, or whatever. That's a part of it. Number 8 is transportation. This is where it starts to get a little sticky for me, if we're being honest, in the housing space. The city has passed some very specific technical transportation policies in the last couple of years.
And can you tell us a little bit about that? Or
yeah, a little bit. So pros and cons to all of these. Obviously, if you've driven on Patterson at 5 p.m. anytime lately, we probably need to be having a conversation about this stuff. Population keeps going up, and we're going to have to do something about that. There's a lot of folks in our elected officials right now who really see a priority being the need to incentivize multimodal transportation. So they would like to see a community where it's easier to bike or walk more. I think they argue that that's a certain lifestyle that's good for you, or a cheaper one, or it takes cars off the road. On those plans, I won't comment on this plan while I'm still a member of it, but I can speak to some of those recent plans that prioritize that stuff. If you take the TEDS plan, for example, it really changed a lot of the rules about how roads get built in new developments and everything. And a lot of that was driven by previous documents that said we want to make it a better community to ride a bike in. There's benefits. It's better if you're not getting hit by a car. Or
Absolutely.
there might be less traffic when I'm driving if other people bike or vice versa. That's all good and well.
The road wage element is always something.
Oh,
there.
I know.
Especially if you're a bikist.
So, not a concern I have with total philosophical opposition. But on the TEDS plan, they mandated larger sidewalks, larger roads, a number of other amenities in our community for new development that we quantified are going to raise the cost of a new home, depending on which one. Probably $3,000 a home, no matter what, and in many developments, it could be a lot more than that. If it's me, and I put myself in the shoes of a first-time home buyer or maybe a retiree looking to downsize, probably if I'm a young, active person, I would like it if I could bike a little bit more. What I would not like is if housing prices were high enough that I couldn't afford to live there in the first place. That benefit wouldn't help me a whole heck of a lot.
Right.
So really shows you interpretation is going to matter a lot here. But, on that priority, bike and multimodal transportation is something that I think a lot of members of the group have identified as a priority. I think some transit options are, but a lot of it even comes down to, hey, what infrastructure do we want to have and why? Really, if you were to just go survey random people around Grand Junction and said, hey, how do you feel about transportation? Every opinion you get's going to be a strong one. It's just, it might mean some very different things.
Oh, yes.
If you ask me how I feel, I'm going to say I don't like that someone runs every red light at least once before traffic actually changes. That might be a little different conversation. But
Right.
the last one's number 9, and that's social equity. I'll point out that was identified as a lower priority. Amongst the group, it is a priority of some merit, depending on where you fall here. I struggle on a personal level philosophically. I don't identify closely with a lot of advocates in this space, so I don't necessarily know if I speak the language. But it asks certain questions. I'm going to try to give them the best devil's advocate I can here. Okay. When we're designing the regulations for how our community is going to change in the future, or what we'll build, or how we'll vote on stuff, a lot of environmental considerations can have different impacts on other stuff. So like we were talking about, mandating more energy efficient homes creates more expensive homes that are energy efficient. My best good faith argument for including this as a factor, if I'm concerned that we're mandating environmental benefits that are more expensive than they're worth, I could look at this and say, hey, the fact that you're mandating homes are now $405,000 instead of $400,000, there's a fair number of people in our community who income-wise have been priced out of the housing market at that point. If you pass regulations that lead to lower home inventory, and we're in a housing shortage right now, by the way, that's a lot of the problem. If you make it harder to build more homes, well, the macroeconomics on that are pretty clear. Housing's a game of musical chairs. If we don't have very many chairs get expensive. I look at the social equity lens here and say anything we do that mandates a cost, we need to be careful that we're not imposing that burden on the people who can least afford to do it.
Amen to that. Yes.
I think other people who have other political philosophies could interpret this very differently. But that type of question is one I think everybody ought to think about, right? I've heard other members of advocacy groups who've worked on this plan, or other committee members, talk, for example, about some very, very different questions here. But I think one's worth mentioning. You hear them talk about this concept of food equity. I know I didn't go to the kind of college where they talk that way, but I think I can give it a decent spin. I don't know if you all have heard of the concept of a food desert.
Yes.
Yeah. We have some by the standards of the people who decide that stuff, I guess. It's, you live really far from a grocery store or anything other than the 7-Eleven. If you want to look at this food equity question, when we're deciding how we build our town, what can we do where that's not the case? Where all things considered, people can live close enough to access to food and whatever choice it is they want to make there. On a personal level, I would say I would love to go live on Glade Park out in the country. I'm not going to have terribly convenient access to a grocery store there, but frankly, I could probably afford to drive in and out.
I say that's okay.
Yeah.
Or grow your own.
Yeah, that's a choice I can make. But, I think a couple different policy examples that have come up in this conversation would be prioritizing certain community garden type infrastructure or considering some different grocery store approvals. I kind of question in this case what Nexus government really can do to be helpful here. The plan could never just say, hey, we need to build a grocery store. Well,
Right.
City Market might build the grocery store, but we're probably not going to.
Right.
I think
That's their choice.
exactly, yeah. I think at best you could use this topic when City Market is considering building in your community. Maybe you offer certain impact fee incentives or whatever for them to put it in a certain place or make it more likely that they do. That I think is a fairly positive take on all this. I do hear some of the conversations about we're going to create more farmers markets or community gardens or whatever. I don't think anybody has a problem with that. I question how much it would move the needle.
What I'm hearing, and probably I'm stuck on this, is the comments that I hear are 15-minute cities. And here on the Western Slope just isn't feasible.
Yeah, that's geography. It's not.
Yeah, and so that's what I'm getting from that. I mean, that's big city thinking in small town.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure we're there yet. I'm not sure we need to go there yet.
And
Personally,
the urban density and the you won't own, you'll rent. Because I have a problem with the fact that in the city you have to, and Cody Kennedy said this isn't exactly true, but it's all R8. So if you're doing a new build, it's R8. And I'm thinking, that's not, what if I want to build a single family home in my community?
right.
Is that the government's role to tell me, no, I can't have that space to do that? And if knowing the legislation that's made condo developers not want to sell condos, they want to rent condos. And so it's keeping away from home ownership again.
Oh, big time.
Again.
So actually, I'm going to pause the sustainability portion specifically because those
Okay.
are two of my very favorite and most impactful topics in the housing industry space right now. And I think they warrant being addressed in light of this conversation.
Okay.
If you want to look at infill density and zoning reform, that's been a very trendy and popular policy debate nationwide for, basically since COVID and since we've really started seeing the housing price extremes. As someone who's representing the housing industry, my view there is people should be allowed to build as densely as they want to build.
I think you just said it in a nutshell there.
Yeah, I think
as
so.
They want to build.
That's it. So to me, good density policy would be density is allowed. Some communities have taken that to mean density is required.
Right.
If you look at R8 zoning, for example, you could build a single family home on that, but it means you're allowed to build denser than that, right?
Oh, so it doesn't mean you have to.
Well, here it doesn't mean you have to. There's
Okay.
places where it definitely could mean that you have to. It just says that all things considered, we as a community want to make it easier to build higher density and not harder. And actually, it's kind of funny. I mean, I know this is very much a conservative space, so I'll pick on Boulder a little bit.
Okay.
Boulder, up until very recently, has had about the highest home prices, excluding like Aspen and Telluride in our state. Boulder considers itself a very progressive community, and
Yes, it does.
in most ways they are. Boulder has had what amounts to a new construction moratorium for like 30 years. It's very elitist, it's this and that. Their housing prices are high because they won't build anything new,
Right.
and therefore only rich people live in Boulder.
Right?
That to me doesn't sound very progressive, and I think that's been changing the last year or two. But
Right.
shoot, if you want to just blanket oppose density, that's kind of Boulder-y to me. Personally, do I want to live in dense development? No, I don't. I want to live 100 miles out in the desert and be a hermit.
Glade Park.
That's right, yeah. But you know what? If housing prices are a function of an inventory shortage, density anywhere will help with housing prices, then a lot of people are into that. That's all good. So yeah, if you want to look at, really you could take zoning regulation through this environmental or whatever lens. Really, all things considered, the more density we can encourage, so long as there's people who find that desirable, that's probably a net community benefit. And who does and doesn't approve of density does not break on conventional party lines, so it's probably worth noting that density is something we've had a conversation about. So, but the other thing you talked about was construction defects reform and the condo price issue. This is probably the most important housing priority at the state capitol this year. It's been a problem for a long time, and momentum has kind of finally arrived on its side. Just a great case study in the law of unintended consequences and government intervention. If you look at new condo construction across the 50 states, Colorado's consistently either 49th or 50th dead last. When you look at our housing market here on the western slope, put yourself in the shoes of that first-time home buyer. The inventory that's actually available for sale here right now kind of starts at that $350,000 mark, and that's how much you got to qualify for if you want to own anything. Well, historically, and in most healthy housing markets, most places, condos, row homes, townhomes, any sort of multifamily for sale housing is a great halfway point. There's a lot of people who could afford the $230,000 condo and not the $350,000 home. We have a lot of single people buying 4-bed, 2-bath houses because that's the cheapest house for sale. They probably would prefer not to have that too, but they want to own something. Colorado had a consumer protection law passed in the mid-2000s, I think 2007 or 8, that was viewed as we're going to protect the consumer rights of people who live in condos that have been built in a shoddy way, that have defects. And if builders are doing bad work, then they should be made liable for that or whatever. That sounds great, right? Yeah, they should be accountable for their work. That's not what has happened.
No, it's not.
What happened was that we've essentially made condos illegal for sale. You'll notice around Grand Junction, we're actually building a lot of apartments and condos right now, and that's probably a good thing. They're all for rent. You couldn't go buy one if you wanted to because they can't be sold. Well, it's ultimately because the liability that we imposed on builders of for sale multifamily housing is so high, and the standards for suing them are so low that very insignificant things, all things considered, can trigger these big lawsuits. Insurance for builders of that type of stuff is so high that what they would have to pay for insurance to do that, they could never make a profit on building condos, and so they don't.
Yeah, exactly. They just can't afford to do it. So
we passed consumer protection laws like that to help the little guy, right? Well, now the little guy can't ever own a home because only expensive ones are legal.
Interesting dilemma we found ourselves in.
Yes, it is. But this is kind of a cool one, though. I don't see a lot of political consensus at the state legislature for the most part the last few years. There is some consensus on this. Not complete consensus. There's some pretty terrible actors in that space. Right now, it looks like this has a shot at the finish line in some form or another. You know, I think a big faction of the Democrats have looked at this and come to the same conclusion that maybe the Republicans have been at for a while, and said, "Hey, we swung too far. We're overly restrictive. You can't be a consumer protected individual if you don't own a condo at all."
Can't protect
That utopian society just doesn't
That's
exist
right.
yet.
So that's a function of density, honestly. If the only housing type you can sell is a single family home, it's going to be hard to be pretty dense. I could take the equity angle on this and say build housing people can afford in the first place. That's good, but this is one actually with your listeners or with people in your communities who are interested in the policy space. Kind of a narrow window of opportunity to get something done. Something I think the Western Slope delegation is very supportive of. But if they were asked to help support this, to write their legislator, to comment during committee hearings or what have you, every little bit counts on this one. I am optimistic about it, but an equivalent bill has been introduced every year for like 15 years, right? And they've never got it across the finish line. The trialist lawyers really like this. Obviously, they can sue really easy.
Of course.
They've killed it every year, and that's why we are where we are. there's still opposition, so it's not a done deal for sure. And if people can support that, that'll be awesome. So I just look at all of this stuff, honestly, whether it's this issue or any other, and say, when we make laws that impact housing, we should look at the immediate pros and cons. But to me, I want to live in a community where my kids could afford to own a home 20 years from now.
Right, exactly.
We got a lot of communities around us where that's not the case. Try being born in Glenwood Springs 25 years ago and see if you can buy a home there now.
Right.
Yeah, no.
Right.
Yeah.
So I know that we've kind of dominated. You said that there was something you wanted to address, but I want to make sure that before we end, that we address what is the impact that, you said you thought we needed to go to some of the meetings and what could be our potential impact on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But talk about what you wanted to talk about first
So
on the
We'll
sustainability.
keep quiet.
Because
Let you have it.
I made you move.
what I'll actually do is sum it up. I think you can look at this plan, if I'm making the best faith argument I can here. This plan identifies a menu of options for elected officials in our community to choose from in the future. It's put a lot of beneficial things on the menu. There's some vegetables that we'll probably have to eat one way or another, whether we like them or not, and it puts the ability to plan around those challenges in the future in place. But, there's a lot of people who think very differently than we do on a lot of these issues, and for them, this could put some very challenging things on the menu for people who think our way. This could be used to justify, I think, some pretty radical environmentalist policies. It could be used to justify some pretty good conservation environmentalist policies. Ultimately, accountability for how this is implemented is going to fall on the elected officials that are making planning decisions based off it. But exactly what's on the menu and what the intent of the plan that City Council will pass here pretty soon is interpreted to be for the future is going to depend on community input right now. The next law that passes that uses this to inform its decisions, on the ground, that might be 3 or 4 years from now, right? So it's pretty far downstream. But the way this all is phrased right now is the time where we have some say over how it shakes out. So on this plan, it's on engagegj.com, it's on the City of Grand Junction's website, and I'm sure you can share it with your listeners or whoever. It gets into a lot of this stuff in nuts and bolts level detail. I think any one member of our community is going to read this and find some stuff that they're very concerned about. I would really encourage all of you to take that look, see what you think about certain elements here. Know that as a committee, broad range of opinions here, and the plan's certainly not all my opinions or anyone else's. I'm probably in the minority on a lot of these issues, but that's the way our city council is right now. A couple things that you can do to help influence this the way that you as a community member see fit. Public comment on the draft plan opens, I believe, April 21st or 23rd. We can fact check that. And it's going to be open for a month. There'll be a couple different opportunities to comment on this. You can comment online. You can email your city councilors directly. And there'll actually also be a couple different community input events. One of them, and let me double check the date, is an open house event at the Lincoln Park Barn. So the public comment period is April 19th through May 17th.
Okay.
Speak now or forever hold your peace is what I'm saying. And the open house, let me check my calendar for you real quick. Is on the 21st. Yep, it's on the 21st from 1 to 3 p.m. at the Lincoln Park Barn.
Which is a Sunday, correct?
It is a Sunday, yeah. Yeah, they've done one of those events previously. They have different folks that have been involved in the crafting, have kind of presentations on all the different elements, and then a couple interactive ways people can provide feedback. I will tell you from having attended some of those public events on this plan in specific, there's certainly different factions of citizens who think very different things.
Yes.
I'm not sure that I've seen a great turnout from people who are concerned about housing affordability like a lot of us in this space are. Like they always say, if you don't show up, you kind of don't get a say in things. If your political opposition dominates the conversation and you don't contest it, you can't complain a whole heck of a lot. I would just really encourage, really whoever you are in our community, this plan's going to impact you for better or worse. now would be a very good time to have your say.
And do you think the say makes a difference if enough people show up and say, I'm really concerned about the built environment? Just picking that for.
Yeah, so I could give you the cynical take and the optimistic take here, so I'll do both. If you're someone who does not agree with the philosophy of our current city council, it could feel a little bit like it doesn't matter right now. Ultimately, if you really disagree with something in this plan and council likes it, they're likely to pass it anyway, right? That said, even with this council, I think concerned citizens can influence decisions, absolutely.
Okay.
But even if it doesn't, here's the optimistic take. This is why it matters. You can certainly get your opposition or support counted. They record how many people attended and spoke in favor or opposition of X, Y, and Z, and that's part of the public record. You can get your specific comments entered as having been made on this. Those too will be part of the public record. If this council passes a plan you don't like or implements it in a way that you don't like, well, they won't be the current city council forever. If that language is included from the get-go in this, you're helping a future city council interpret it closer to the way that you would like, or preventing a worse one from doing it worse, for that matter.
Okay.
So
that gives people an incentive to actually become involved.
It does, yeah. Really, the more feedback, the better here. What I can tell you is that if you consider yourself a conservative, if you think modern environmentalism has maybe gone too far, the fact is that your political opposition is really good at turning out and participating in this stuff. You can bet that they're going to get their numbers counted. I mean, there certainly are people in our community who want to do things like ban cars or close traffic lanes to make more room for bikes, or people who want to ban gas appliances in new homes. This plan doesn't really do any of that, but I can guarantee you people who hold those opinions are going to show up and comment and try to push this plan as close as possible to something that could justify that.
Way.
So no, this plan can be a great platform for a good future. It could be a Trojan horse for a bad one, and it's going to depend on how the community weighs in.
Very good.
That is great.
That is very interesting.
That is, yes.
Awesome.
So is there anything you wanted to share that we just went, nope, you don't get to talk yet?
No, I think that pretty well covers it. I guess I would encourage people, look at this through a couple lenses. I really want you to think second and first order and the law of unintended consequences. Even if there's something in this plan that actually you do like right now that would make a good law, think about the big picture impacts that might have.
Think about the condos.
Think about the condos, that's right. But you know what? I'll give the devil his due on that comment too. If there's something that you bristle at a little bit or that you find challenging or disagreeable, you should think about the 10 and 20 year downstream impacts of that too. I mean, I think if we encourage super reckless, irresponsible water use, we don't really do that now. I think we're pretty good stewards as it may be. I do want to be ready for a future where if there's less water, we're not preventing new houses from being built and everything, and prices get out of control. So take an open mind at it, but participate, and that's what I would leave you with.
Okay.
Very good.
Well, you've been listening to Mesa County Compass. This is the truth as we see it, the facts as we know them. You decide.